Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on April 2nd with Bonnie L. Bossert on what is investigative genetic genealogy. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Jacqueline Kanyuck on research in Canada, an introduction. Before we begin, here's a little bit about Jacqueline. Jacqueline Kanyuck is a research specialist and international indexing instruction writer at Family Search. She graduated from BYU with a bachelor's degree in family history genealogy. Jacqueline's research specialties include the U.S. South Central region and Canadian research. She is an accredited genealogist in Quebec and Ontario research. And we'll now turn the time over to Jacqueline.
Great, thank you, Olivia. I'm so excited to be able to teach this class for you guys today about researching in Canada. So we have a few hefty objectives today, so I apologize that we might have to rush through some of these as our time limit is very tight. But today I really wanted to talk a little bit about the history and background in Canada, go over civil registration records, including important dates across the country, and even look at some examples of the records. Then move into census records, including the dates and the value of the records that you can get from them. Talk about naturalization and immigration dates, laws, and record collections. And then cover some other key records in Canada, as well as touching on some online record databases and websites for you to use. So let's begin by going over some history and background in Canada. I always like to talk about the history and background of Canada by showing maps. I think it really helps to create a visual for us to understand the transformation of Canada through time. And as you understand the transformation of Canada, including its border changes and disputes between different countries, it really helps you to get a better snapshot of what the records you're looking are, what records look like in Canada over time. Canada really started as a big European colonization effort, starting around 1000 AD when Norsemen started building temporary fishing camps along the eastern coast. And it really wasn't until about 1667 that we have some more successful French settlements in North America. So about 1606, you have the area of Port Royal down over here, and then Quebec in about 1609. And along this time of France settling into Canada and what they called New France, the English settlements also started up in Virginia, and there began to be a lot of disputes between the English and France in all this territory, all this land. And so starting in about 1670, a big royal charter was actually given to the Hudson Bay Company, and it gave sole trading rights in this huge area in the western part of what we now know as Canada. So a lot of that was given solely to this one big company, and the rest of the area of Canada was disputed between England and France. And during that time, you have places like New France and Quebec, which supported a lot of more French settlements. And a lot of these different places where you have the red and the blue overlap is where English involvement and English territories began to pop up. At the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in 1763, Canada really became under British rule, and that was due to the Treaty of Paris. So this gave a lot of British territory here, except for a few little islands and some areas of Quebec and Newfoundland, which kept more of a French control in the area. However, all that Hudson Bay Company still administered to what we call Rupert's Land over in the west. In about 1783 and 1784, after the American Revolution, about 30,000 different Loyalist refugees fled to Canada following the Revolution. And these different Loyalists settled in the coastal regions, in the eastern townships of Quebec area, and in these areas between Ottawa and St. Lawrence River valleys, which is known as Upper Canada or Ontario nowadays. And then you have different different separations of different places as well, like Nova Scotia in about 1784. It started to be split between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and all the Acadians that were living there kind of split off into different sections. Another big boundary change started in 1791, which followed the Constitutional Act. In this point, Quebec was a little territory, a little province, and it was then divided into what was called Upper and Lower Canada, which may seem a little bit counterintuitive, being that Upper Canada was actually southern and Lower Canada was the northern area. And the reason for these name changes is actually due to their position on the St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River was a big major point where people were settling, and so all of their divisions and land kind of based off of that river. So you had to go up the river to go down into the south where modern day Ontario exists, and you were lower down the river near the mouth of the river in Lower Canada in the modern day of Quebec. From about 1800 to 1815, you have a big, huge immigration of people to Upper Canada, and these include about 23,000 different loyalists, or as they're termed, late loyalists, and their descendants. These are a lot of people from upstate New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, all moving into the Upper Canada region. And so there's a much heavier influence of English settlements down in the Upper Canada region rather than the Lower Canada region, which had a lot more French influence. From 1815 to 1850, there was another big immigration push from Scotland and Ireland to the Atlantic provinces, which you can see kind of in the purple regions on this map. Every year, a few thousand immigrants would come during that time period, and especially during the big famine migration from Ireland, tens of thousands of people settled into the farms and towns of Upper and Lower Canada, and many also went to New Brunswick. So there's a lot of immigration changes, a lot of immigrants coming in and influencing the laws, the procedures, and the territories and boundary lines during this time period. In 1841, the province of Canada was officially formed, and it was formed by uniting that Upper and Lower Canada, and then was renamed to Canada West and Canada East, which follows more of that cardinal directions of East and West. Your Canada West is more of our modern day Ontario area, and Canada East is Quebec. And this whole act of union was really just to try to merge the two colonies together, try to merge these two ideas, two ways of being between this French law, British law rule. Then in 1867 is actually when the Dominion of Canada formed, and that means Canada actually became a country in 1867. So it is actually a very, very, very new country. If you think about it, even compared to the United States, we still have about almost 100 years on Canada of experience as a country in total. So 1867 is really when Canada started bringing about self-rule, and they formed the Canada Confederation with 4 provinces. You have Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And you have a lot of other areas outside of those 4 main provinces, but none of them were official provinces in Canada themselves. And then in 1868, Rupert's Land was then bought by Canada. So from there, we begin to expand westward out into the different Northwest Territories, into British Columbia, and so forth. In 1870, Manitoba was the next province to join into Canada. And you can actually see that little small, tiny yellow square is what Manitoba started as. And if you know the map nowadays, it's very small to what it is now, and it will continue to grow as more Western expansion continues. Something to note is that starting in 1870 and continuing on for a long while, there's a lot of boundary changes and a lot of fights between Manitoba and Ontario of who gets what land as their boundaries collide. In 1871, British Columbia joins as the 6th province of Canada. And then in 1873, Prince Edward Island, also known as PEI, joins as 7th province. Then we move all the way forward until about 1898, when Yukon split off from the Northwest Territories. So now you have 2 different territories along with all these new provinces being formed as westward expansion begins. In 1905, Alberta and Saskatchewan were added as the 8th and 9th provinces. And you can see here we have more continual growth of Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba. All of them are starting to grow into what we know more today as their land masses. Then in 1949 is when the newest and latest province entered into the Confederation of Canada, and that's Newfoundland. Newfoundland didn't actually join as a province until 1949, which is very recent if you think about it. And then the most recent change happened in 1999 when none of it became Canada's third territory. And so that was the first time after 50 years of any sort of boundary changes, any sort of addition into the Confederation of Canada. But by 1999, you can see a lot of the borders are formed to what we know now today as our different provinces. So now that we kind of get a little basis of our background and history of the changes of the provinces, I want to talk about civil registration. A lot of civil registration depends upon when provinces were entered into the Confederation of Canada, and it kind of has a lot of compliance issues along the way. Civil registration, hopefully most of you know what this is. It's our birth, marriage, and death records. They're equivalent to our US vital records. In fact, throughout Canada, you'll see them either referred to as civil registration, vital statistics, or vital records. It really depends on the time period and the province that you're looking at the records, what they will be called. However, most people will know the term civil registration as you're looking at the records. It's important to note that the provinces were the ones who created, maintained, and preserved those records. So you need to know the different provincial laws of when they were created, how they were maintained, and the privacy laws that kind of govern them nowadays. So that nowadays only a set number of years has to pass before you can view some of those past records, which can create a barrier, especially because Canada is such a new country. A lot of privacy laws are way stricter. So you might not have access to as many records as you're used to with United States records. Another thing to note is that general compliance across Canada was not really achieved until about 1920s, 1925s due to some vital statistic laws that were finally enacted, which means that while records may have been created, they might not have been preserved, or they might have started and stopped, or just in general not created at all in certain areas of the provinces, even though other towns or local counties might have been creating records nearby. So really all the dates for records are going to vary by province. They'll probably vary by county and certainly by town. I want to look at some of these charts here that have like dates of the birth, marriages, and deaths available in the different provinces. And I've kind of broken them out by the different regions in Canada as they kind of follow similar rules of thumb when it comes to record creation. The first one being the Maritime or Atlantic provinces. So this includes New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador. A lot of these records in the Maritime and Atlantic provinces are really governed by church records that were submitted as copies civilly. And keep in mind, so you have birth records that start in 1800 in New Brunswick. However, that's again not going to cover all of the area of the province, but maybe select areas or counties or towns that have records that early. A lot of these dates are all available on the Family Search Research Wiki page for each province. So don't worry about marking all these down, really use the wiki to create your own list, create your own charts to kind of map out the record dates that you're looking for birth, marriages, and deaths. Another thing I wanted just to point out some things on this, Prince Edward Island. A lot of those early records are birth and baptism records combined. And that will be a general theme across many records, but it's definitely a big thing in Prince Edward Island and in Newfoundland here. The next region we want to talk about is the central provinces, which is Ontario and Quebec. Ontario was very good about keeping records starting in 1869. So shortly after Confederation, they finally started cracking down on their province to get records created and preserved. And they have a really good systematic approach and a lot of standardized forms very early on in that 1860s time period. However, before then, they do have some marriages starting in 1801. And you'll find that as a general theme across civil registration and vital records in general, that marriage records are generally kept earlier because they had to do with things such as taxes and property that had a bigger impact on things in society rather than births and deaths. And you'll notice then as well here, Quebec has some very, very early dates. And while that might be exciting, they're not all, those are really church records for Quebec. The Quebec government actually required churches to send copies of baptisms, marriages, and burials to the government archives to use as vital records after a certain point in time. However, those government copies are now super heavily restricted. You can go and see all those restrictions on their Quebec government website, but it's very restricted, such as like a person named in the record can order it, an immediate family member or legal representative can have access to them, especially after that 1900 time period. So you can kind of get into some harder records to access after that 1900 time period, where you're dealing with a lot heavier privacy laws in Quebec. So really rely on the Durand collection, rely on church records as you're doing research in Quebec, and there's some great records and resources out there for those. Another interesting quirk about Quebec is that it wasn't until 1994 that the government began to require separate vital records that weren't church records. So up until that 1994 time period, churches were still sending in copies of vital records to use for government records. So it's just like an interesting quirk to know about Quebec and to know what you're dealing with. There's a huge, heavy church influence in the records. The next region are the prairie provinces. This includes Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. All of these records have some great listings, great marriages, great births and burials. However, most of them are not, you have to order them. So you might be able to access some indexes online, but then you have to order them from the provinces to be able to have the full record, which is great because they have them. However, you have to do some digging in their indexes, and some, such as Saskatchewan's marriages, they don't even have the index really available online. So it might be working more closely with the provincial archivists and talking with them over the phone or through email to try to get access to the records you need. Some of these you can order their records online. However, some of them you actually have to mail in letters to request those vital records. But they all have some really great databases, so don't count them out just because you have to do a little extra digging to get them. Then lastly, kind of have our catch-all, the other provinces and territories, which includes Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, Yukon Territory, and British Columbia. You'll notice here that Nunavut and Northwest Territories share the same dates, and that's because all of those Nunavut Territory records are the Northwest Territory records until 1999. And after that 1999 point, then you can go to Nunavut's Health Services office. But for many of us, that probably won't help us when we're looking at our ancestral research. So you really have to be applying to the Northwest Territories vital offices to get information. And again, with most of these territories, you do have to request them on forms that are available from their vital statistic divisions. British Columbia has some really great archives, and their archives actually also cover more dates than these that are listed on this chart. They have baptismal indexes from about 1836 to 1888, and even some colonial marriages from about 1859 to 1872. So while these charts give you some ideas of general dates to look for in your vital records and civil registration, it's really important to actually get into the archives, look up the different databases and collections that the archives and vital statistic agencies actually have to know the dates that you're looking for. I wanted to show a couple examples of some of the records that you might encounter along the way. Here's an example of an Ontario birth record. You can see here there's 3 main columns, and on these Ontario birth records, most of them all look like this in Ontario, where they have 6 individuals on each page with 3 columns, and in them you'll get information such as their name, their birth date, gender, the names of their parents, and usually the profession or occupation of the father. And then prior to 1869, Ontario wanted to try to make up for vital records that they might have missed. So they did try to have substitute records created and have people come in post 1869 to submit previous births. And they have some different collections that might have birth records before 1869. So it's important to go check out their collections to see if there were late registrations for your own ancestors. But otherwise, as you're looking at different civil registration records, as you're dealing with things before that 1860s time period, really check church records, check the newspapers and histories and published genealogies. Many of them might list birth dates that could be helpful for you. Here's another example of a birth record, and this one's from Newfoundland. And you can see here that not only do they have the birth information for this individual and their parents, but they also have the baptismal information. And that's because this was actually a copy of a baptismal record, a baptismal register from a church in Newfoundland. So again, you'll find a lot of combinations of birth and baptismal records as you go throughout the country and look at their different vital records. This is one example of a marriage record from Quebec, and you can notice that it's actually in French. As you're dealing with Quebec research, that's something to be aware of. You're going to deal with a lot of French records, a lot of French language. Only certain areas of Quebec do you actually encounter English records. So it's really important to start practicing now if you're doing Quebec research to deal with French records. And it might seem very hard to get into French records, especially if you don't know the language. But one thing to keep in mind is that across different churches, across different areas, people generally use the same type of format when creating records, which means that a record written in English probably has a similar format to a record written in French. So sometimes what I like to do is compare side by side an English record of like a register form like this comparing to this French register and see right here at the beginning of this record, it lists all these dates. It always starts with a date here. And then as you move on, it talks about, this is a child of this person. And so you can kind of get a format and try to piece together how these clerks, how these different church records were made or marriage records were made, and follow a pattern with them to help identify keywords and phrases that are used a lot in the records. So don't be scared with French records. Just keep trying, keep working it out. Sometimes it's easiest to just get a highlighter out and try to start highlighting keywords and phrases that you recognize. Use the genealogical lists on the research wiki pages. Those are really helpful as you're trying to learn new languages and read new languages in the records. And there's a lot of other great online resources such as Facebook pages, or even if you're at BYU, you have a lot of access to people with language skills. Reach out to neighbors, reach out to the different language clubs to see if they could help you to read or understand some general vocabulary along the way. Here's a marriage record in Ontario, and you can see here again, they follow that 3-column, same format as they do with their birth records. And each column here is its own marriage record. And as the columns go down, they list the couple getting married, their ages and residence. They continue to talk about the marriage information, their religious denomination, which is a huge point in Canada records. Most of your Canada records will talk about the religious denomination, which really helps for you to go into church records and get more information. So really take a look at all these deep records. Make sure to pick out names of witnesses that are included here. You never know if those are maybe distant relatives or neighbors that could help you to identify more about your family in the future. And here's a death record, again, in Ontario. So you can see between the marriages, deaths, and births, they all look very similar in format. They really had a standardized approach in Ontario, which is great to see. And you can get a lot of really great information, such as on this one, they talk about the deceased individual's name, age, occupation, their birthplace, and cause of death. But you can also see on this first record, they even list the town in Scotland where they were born. And not every record is going to have that great little piece of information, but your ancestors might. So it's always worth checking, and make sure to scour the entire record before you count it out. All right, let's touch over into census records. Census records is a very big topic. It's a very important record to be using, whether in the United States, whether you're in Canada. It's a great tool to start with, especially as you're creating timelines for your family. Census records in Canada started in 1871 and then were taken every 10 years since. Something to note is that 1871 is the first national government census. Before 1871, there are other partial or incomplete censuses, especially between 1842 and 1871. But again, those are only partial. They weren't done by a federal government. They were all done provincial-wide or town-wide or county-wide. So you'll really get a different scattering of records from there. And currently, the most recently available census for Canada is the 1931 census. And this just recently came out, so there are still more records being created with it, more indexes that are being improved and updated as time goes on, as people are doing more research into it. So if you haven't had luck yet with the 1931 census, keep checking, keep going back into it. As indexes are improved, as searching is improved, you'll be able to find your ancestors more easily. Something to note with census localities that's different from the United States is how the censuses are actually arranged. Generally, if you think about the US censuses, they're arranged in states and counties and towns, and they all really follow the voting districts. They don't cross over between county lines. They stay where you would think on a map. But in Canada, they actually follow census districts and census sub-districts, which means that they're not bound to the normal counties or township boundary lines. So they can cross over, and one year they might be in one district in the census, and the next they'll be in a completely different one. So really take advantage of different census voting district maps. And those will be helpful if you're able to know where your ancestor was living in the census before. You can use that to compare to those district maps later to help locate your your ancestors in those censuses. And a lot of the local archives, genealogy centers, even digitized on Family Search and Ancestry, there are census district maps and on LAC. So check around for those if you're having trouble finding your ancestors in the records. You get a lot of really great information from censuses. I feel like censuses are the most used yet underused records out there. And I say that because a lot of people think to use censuses, but they're not actually taking all the pieces of a census to compile something for your family and to compile clues and hints to base the rest of your research plan off of. Some great pieces of information that you'll find in Canada censuses include the name, relationships of families, ages, maybe years of birth or places of birth, marital statuses, the your religion that they belong to, ethnic origins of your parents, as well as maybe places of birth for parents, as well as immigration years or naturalization years. And obviously, as you go later in time, you'll get more information on these censuses, but you really want to scour every piece of detail you can from a census. And it's also important to note that Canada also took censuses outside of population schedules. So they had agricultural schedules, industrial schedules, and other types of censuses throughout the years. And they're usually following the population schedule in the same area. So you might have to flip through extra pages to find them, but they might exist there and give you some more insight into your family. Maybe you'll learn more about a farm that they were living on, or maybe the business that they were taking care of. You'll find more about the financials there or the property that they owned. However, not all of those extra schedules were preserved or even digitized. Many of them were just thrown away at a certain point, so they might not have access to them. But if you do have access to them, you have some really gold nuggets of information that really allow you to expand on the context and understand your family a lot better. This is the 1931 census. I just wanted to look in a little bit at a family here so you can kind of gather what you might be able to learn from the census. This is the family of Jack Waters McCraig. And here he states that he lives with his wife, Stella May, and his two children, Robert John and Jean Vernice, and his cousin, Jean Dunsmuir. And here it says that he and his cousin were from Scotland, and his wife was born in the US, and the kids were all born in Saskatchewan. From here, we learn that he was then he immigrated to Canada in 1911, and his wife immigrated in 1912. One thing I like to note here is that his wife has a naturalization date of 1914. However, he doesn't have one. And this is because he was a British subject. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But because he came from Scotland before a certain time period, he was already a British subject, so he did not have to naturalize when he moved to Canada. He was automatically just a citizen there under British rule. And we also learn that here his cousin immigrated in 1917. Here he states that he's a Presbyterian religion and he's a mechanic in an auto repair shop. So we learn a lot about Jack and his family in these records. Census record availability changes over time and based on the years. I generally rely on these three main online sources for Canada censuses. However, there are a lot more websites that do have census holdings, such as Find My Past and My Heritage. However, these three of Library and Archives Canada, Ancestry, and Family Search are the big three people with the online sources. While this is great, it also has some drawbacks that they're the three main ones, meaning that they tend to share indexes and they share images for a lot of these different record collections, which can be good, but it also can mean that if you have bad clarity on one image, it might not change on the other website. However, they might have their own set of images and they might have their own set of indexes, meaning that you can find ancestors more easily in one rather than the other, or your images might be a better quality on one versus the other. So in general, I always recommend looking at all three websites as you are trying to find your census records. Another great thing that they have is that they might share indexes. However, each website has their own search algorithms, and their databases all rely on different algorithms to do those searches, even if they have the same indexes and information put in there, which means that based on your different search techniques, you might get different search results on all three websites. So again, if you're struggling to find an ancestor on one website, always switch over and look at the other ones as well. Here's just a little bit more availability across the websites. I want to kind of go quickly through here. The other thing I want to touch on are the prairie province censuses. So starting in 1906, a law was enacted to have more censuses to be held in the prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And this is due to a huge amount of westward expansion. And this created a huge need by the Canadian government to account for the population in these areas to get better representation and better taxation understandings. So this means for us who had ancestors living in those areas that we have more censuses available to us to track our ancestors in the in-between years of the censuses, which is really great. In Newfoundland and Labrador, while they didn't join until way late in time into Canada, they do have some of their own separate censuses that were created. So it's important to check out the 1921, the 1935, the 1941 censuses to see if you can find your ancestors in those areas. All right, moving into naturalization immigration. This is a huge topic when talking about Canada, especially because most of our ancestors either would come through the US and move up to Canada, or vice versa, they would go into Canada and come down to the US. There's a lot of talk about immigration here and a lot of hardships when it comes to Canada immigration and naturalization. So pre-1867, before Canada was actually a nation, everything naturalization followed the British law or provincial laws that were in place. So that means everything's going to be different depending on the province that they lived in when it comes to getting citizenship. And then from about 1763 and 1947, non-alien residents of Canada were considered British subjects, which, like I talked about earlier when we looked at that census example, is why Jack did not need to become a citizen in Canada. Because he was already a British subject from living in Scotland, he did not need to naturalize when he came to Canada. So up until 1947, all those British subjects, all the people coming from the British Isles, had no need to naturalize in Canada. So you won't find records for them during that time, which is unfortunate for us. But there are other records to use to help to find birthplaces and town places where they might have come from the British Isles. When you're looking for naturalization, you want to look for some clues in censuses, look in local court minutes, homestead records, passports, voting registers, and military papers. All of them could contain clues that your ancestor naturalized. Just keep in mind and look at dates and places as they're in these records. I wanted to talk about a couple of different laws that impacted naturalization in Canada. The first one being the Naturalization Act in Upper Canada in 1828. This gave British citizenship to men who had been residents in Upper Canada for about 7 years. That was one of the main and only requirements up until that point. Then in 1841, some more things were enacted and they had additional information for those who wanted to be naturalized. They had to give their full name, their place of residence, They had to give expiration of that 7 years residence requirements. They had to state, okay, when is my 7 years up so that I can naturalize? And then they had information about if they were under 16, how old were they, or when was the date when they would be 16 so they could naturalize themselves as well. So there's a lot of extra laws enacted to get more information from these naturalized citizens. Then in 1868, the law of naturalization allegiance naturalization process became federal. Before this point, we didn't have Canada as an actual country, so there was no federal process towards naturalization. So starting in 1868, they started finally making a process for it and getting it away from the provincial control. 1914, the Naturalization Act then started to require a federal department to issue naturalizations. So as they go throughout time, Canada's learning how to become a country. They're learning how to give citizenship. So they start creating more departments for people to go through to get citizenship rather than just through any random courthouse in any random place. And then, as we know, 1947 is when the official Canadian citizenship was established. So up until that point, you're going to have a lot of blocks, a lot of gaps of people in citizenship because you have a lot of British subjects moving to Canada. I want to briefly touch on some naturalization databases. Great naturalization databases exist on Library and Archives Canada. Just be aware that there are a lot of record gaps, and one of the biggest gaps is from about 1854 to 1917. A lot of those naturalization records don't exist anymore. They were actually all destroyed as in 1917, they got that new database, that new department. They then started to override all those past certificates of naturalization and started keeping new ones for people. And all that was kept from that time period was a little card index arranged by name. So it's a really sad time for naturalization records. However, there are still, again, some options out there. And if you think about naturalization records during that time period, the information you're looking for, such as places of birth and like town names, probably didn't even exist on those naturalization records to begin with. But it is a huge loss for records. And I wanted to touch on this last bullet point on the list, the naturalization list from 1915 to 1951. This is a great naturalization list database on Library and Archives Canada. And these were all information pulled from the National Gazette. And what they did is that this collection contains annual reports of the Department of Secretary of State that were posted in the Canada Gazette. And so they would post all these annual reports of people getting naturalized. But be aware that not everyone appears in the list. And then after April of 1951, they stopped publishing those reports in general. So you can't get anything more past that point. There are two different parts to this database. The first part is from 1915-1946, which is a purely name index. And they are all published in certificate number order. And so you can search their index by names and country of birth. But there's not a lot of information beyond that. But if you have that certificate number from the index, you can then try to go and find the actual naturalization records. From 1947 to 1951, there are actually digital images of those naturalizations that were published in the Canada Gazette. And you can actually search those later records by month and year publication as well. So really great database to use, but just be aware that they don't have all that much information, but it's still a great tool and a great resource to go look at just in case there's more. They generally have the name, a country of origin, the naturalization date that the certificate was issued, occupation, residence, and hopefully some more certificate number and series so you can then go and submit to try to get the full naturalization records. Now, immigration to Canada is very tricky because before 1865, there are no comprehensive nominal lists of people coming into Canada, no immigration lists. There might be some out there, and there certainly are. People have scoured some up, but they are few and far between, and they might not be digitized, or you might just have to go and view them in person on microfilm. Library and Archives Canada has some great immigration records from about 1750 to 1865, but again, they are limited and definitely not comprehensive for your immigrants who came before that time period. But again, they have some great collections in post-1865. They have some passenger lists for various ports all over, and even some specialized collections for immigrants from China, Ukrainian immigrants, and immigrants from the Russian Empire. So it's great to go check out LAC and see what they have on their websites. And then if you have time to be able to even go in person and look at those passenger lists on microfilm in Canada. This is a little bit of a snapshot of some of those ports that they have available. A lot of them don't start again until 1865, and then 1900 is a big point when they kept more nominal lists, and they started actually keeping more standardized forms for passenger lists. Border crossings are a huge deal, especially as we're dealing with a lot of border crossings between the US and Canada. But it's important to note that border crossings aren't what we think of today. There's not these big posts now that you have to go through. There was a lot more fluidity between the countries. People could walk over on a footbridge, or they would take a boat over, and nobody would really be checking for a lot of these different people coming back and forth. A lot of families lived right across the border from each other, and they would go visit each other multiple times in a year. And a lot of those recordings of them going back and forth they just don't exist because nobody was trying to monitor them. Nobody was controlling those type of things. In the United States, they finally started trying to record these things and get some better standardization around the borders. And they didn't start recording those till 1895. So that's when the United States started keeping border crossings of people coming into the US. And then Canada didn't even start until 1908. So if people are going back and forth, you might have some records on one side, not on the other side. And the forms that you're going to find are going to be very irregular. They're not going to be standardized until well into the 1900s. Across the different ports and stations of entry, everyone has their own different forms that they may or may not have used. But there are two great collections of these different border crossings on Family Search and Ancestry. So I recommend making a timeline of these different border crossings. If you find border crossing records or you find evidence of your family in different parts of the US or Canada, make a timeline and start mapping it out of when did they cross the border here, when did they cross back, and try to track different reasons that they may have crossed over. A lot of people would go across to visit family, and a lot of people would go across for jobs or summer jobs or winter jobs as they needed to escape the cold and they didn't have a job during the winter. In Canada, at one point, they would go down south and vice versa. All right. Next, I want to briefly touch on some other key records out in Canada. Church records. Church records are one of the best records in Canada. I think it's one of my favorite things to do research on when I'm doing Canadian records, especially because there's such great clues to religious denomination when working in Canada. You have all the censuses and the vital records and land records, even that might state religious denominations, which really helps you get into the church records. Church records really began as some of the first records being created in the French settlements of Quebec in the 1620s. So there's a lot of records out there for churches. However, most of them are probably not digitized or widely available. So you might have to be going and digging at society levels or going to different archives or contacting local churches or even local libraries that might have copies of records from these churches. And they really are crucial to research those earlier time periods, especially as you don't have a big national government till the 1860s. You're really running low on some different record types to go looking into. But church records are so great. And they did keep a really good record of them in local dioceses and local churches. Be aware there are 4 main churches of Canada, and 3/4 of Canada really claimed a connection to them, which is the Roman Catholic, the Anglican Church, the United Church of Canada, and the Presbyterian Church in Canada. So those are going to be your 4 main churches. However, there are a lot more churches out there, and each church created a wide range of record types. So you can find ranges of records such as membership lists, baptismals, burials, marriages, confirmations. There's plenty of meeting notes or people writing that they're leaving the church, lots of different things. And all the records depend really upon the clerk or the person in charge of recording for the church at that time. You might find one great clerk and then all of a sudden they'll stop writing and you'll have a new clerk who's really bad at recording records. And it's all give and takes in churches, but I think that's kind of the fun of it, is to find some quirks about the community and you really learn a lot about the social standings as you read the church records. So here's just a few examples of some of the types of records you might find. This is a confirmations page from New Brunswick. Here you can see names and ages here, and this is in French. Here's some Manitoba membership lists, which include birth record information, but also baptismal records and even who gave confirmation of different things. I think we'd be really remiss to not mention the Durand collection. The Durand collection is a big collection of Catholic records which were submitted to the government by churches. And the Durand Institute went through and did this huge indexing and imaging of a bunch of these records. And they've compiled a great resource, which is easily accessible on Ancestry and on Genealogy Quebec. Those are two great websites to start with when you're looking at the Durand collection. And they have lots of great information of not only like birth, marriage, and death, but they also have notarial records and a lot of other great little pieces of church records along the way. And they don't only include Catholic records. They do have special collections for Presbyterians and Church of England, Baptism, Methodists, and other people as well. But there is a huge emphasis in Quebec on the Catholic religion. So just be aware of that as you're going through the records. Land records are also a really great tool. A lot of the time, especially as we're dealing with immigrant ancestors, the first records that your ancestors might be found in Canada will be land records, whether it's them renting or getting mortgages for land or buying land. Sometimes that's your first point of reference to know that your ancestor is actually in the country. The information you find on them is going to vary widely and depends on the area they're buying in or living in. But you could find where and when ancestors lived in the area. You might find spouses or relatives or other heirs, names of neighbors, their past residence, occupations. If they had to do with something with the United Empire Loyalists, they have relationship to Loyalist ancestors, or maybe even military information in those land records. There's a lot of great details that you can pull from them. There are 4 different land systems in Canada, but I think, it's really good to just go in and dig deep into the records, look at different maps in the area to learn more about these systems. The Dominion land system and the patchwork system are a lot closely related to our different land systems that we're used to in the United States. But do some research, going through the research wiki, and there's little pieces and information about each of these systems, but we don't really have time to go into them too much today. When you're looking at land records, there are 4 main key databases to go to. Library and Archives Canada has a great amount of land records. Family Search also has a great databases for land records, as well as Ancestry, and most importantly, your provincial archives. And that's where you'll find a lot of like the deed books, a lot of the maps, a lot of survey maps, which will really help you as you're looking for your ancestors. Military records are also a really great resource. And they'll find a variety of different military records as you're searching, such as service papers, land records, there's deceased veteran lists, and a lot more. When you're searching for military records, all in all, I always recommend to start with Library and Archives Canada. Your National Archive is the best place to start with, especially when it comes to military. But don't stop there. Go on to blogs and society websites. There are so many military junkies out there who spend hours and hours of time as a hobby to just dedicate websites talking about different wars, different battles and battalions. They'll do research on the clothing that they wore during that time period. They'll find random collections in people's attics that they compile all together and show on these blogs for you to learn about your own ancestors as you just do a simple Google search. So always try doing that as you're doing military records. The United Empire Loyalists is another huge topic in Canada, and you could talk for probably hours just about this topic alone. But there are 3 main qualifications for those who were considered United Empire Loyalists, for those who want to know. And they had to live in the British colonies. They fought on the British side in the war, and then they had to then flee to the colonies that remained British, aka they went up to Canada. And all these United Empire Loyalists were then given land grants from the Crown. And so you'll find land grant information in different land books in Canada that will give you information about their military service. They'll give information about their descendants as well, because these land grants were not only given to them, but also to their families as a way to thank them for their service and compensate them for any losses along the way. And as you look in the records, you'll find different special markings for these specific loyalists, such as UE for United Empire, or DUE for the daughters, and SUE for the sons. But be aware that not all those individuals who supported the British cause were considered United Empire loyalists, even though their names might appear in some records. So there are individuals who remained loyal to the British cause, and they were not considered UEs. They were soldiers. There's three main groups: soldiers who came from Quebec or Nova Scotia, and there's also disbanded soldiers of the British Regular Army and Auxiliary German Mercenary Corps. There are some soldiers basically that stayed in Canada that qualified as a loyalist. And then there was also these conscientious objectors, such as Mennonites and Quakers, who supported the British still in different ways, but they refused to take up arms for religious reasons. And many of these loyalists still were given some land-related privileges in the records. However, they weren't referred to as official United Empire loyalists. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then talking about records, we're going to speed through this. There are four main online resources as you're searching for Canadian records: Family Search, Ancestry, Library and Archives Canada, and your provincial archives. Each one of these places has their own perks to them, but I really think the best of both worlds is to use them all together. Don't focus just on one. Branch out, explore, and expand your research bounds. Explore the different databases that each online resource has, and you can find a lot of great information and records on your ancestors. Family Search has a great historical records page, and it grows every year for Canada. And they create guided research plans for Canada. They have a huge learning center page that has courses for you to listen and learn about Canadian research, from census records, vital records, land records, and more. And they have some really great index collections as well. Beyond that, I would never stop at the historical records section on Family Search. Always go into the catalog. And as many of you might know by now, we now have the new catalog available, which has finally kind of combined our old catalog to our now current listings and is actually usable. And so I always love to search by place. I think when you're searching by catalog, I think doing the place level, doing locality level searches from your province, your county, your districts, and your town levels, always search at each locality level in the catalog to find what records you have available. That catalog will show you all the records that are available that are not just indexed, but it'll also show you books or microfilm that might be available in Salt Lake. So keep in mind that you can find those different call numbers and film and fiche numbers in the catalog here. So when you plan a visit to Salt Lake, you can go and find those actual holdings. Family Search Images is also another great tool to search. It has some quirks about it and some things that some of us like to change. But I think it's always worth searching an images search, especially if you're striking out on other pages. They have a great place search that also works with the catalog. They're very similar place searches now. And you can also search by record types. So there's a lot of different ways to search on here. If you're trying to search for specific DGS numbers or specific custodians or record creators, this is also a great place to start with images. And generally, this is the first stop when images are digitized. They'll come to the images search first. The Research Wiki is also the number one place I would say to look. Before you even start doing your research, go to the wiki and create a research plan for yourself. Start by looking at the country level. Make a map of the records that you want to look into. Take a look at the guided researches available, or look into the histories of the different record types available for your areas. And beyond just doing a country search, go into the province level. There's history pages on each part. They'll tell you about maps. They'll show you different collections and databases that you can use. They'll give you links to provincial archives and also different databases that are way out and beyond, or society web pages that have great little pieces of information. Ancestry has a great card catalog. They definitely focus a lot more on their indexed records, but they have a lot of great holdings there for Canada records. So always check out the card catalog on Ancestry. And Library and Archives Canada is probably one of my number one places I would say to search. Not only just to search for collections, but to learn about genealogy in Canada. They have a whole dedicated section to genealogy and family history on their website, and they break it down into different research guides for military, immigration, censuses, and much more. They even have places on here to learn more about Indigenous research. And as you scroll through, they have different collections and research guides on different topics, such as like Acadians, or even going and looking into Black Loyalist refugees. They have so many great little pieces and tools. So just go in and search. Go and search, scroll down through all the pages, and you'll find a lot of great pieces of information. And lastly, the provincial archives. These are the true hidden gems, I would say, that people forget about. The provincial archives have so many great researchers, they have so many great tools. They have historical people who are writing articles constantly or uploading photos and blog posts to teach you about their collections. And they want their collections to be used. They want to share it with the world. So use them as a resource. Contact the archives, tell them about your problems, and see if they can help you to come up with ideas to get past your own brick walls. So I know that was a lot to compile into a short 50 or so minutes, but hopefully this kind of allowed you to get a general glimpse into Canada research, get an idea for some civil registration and census records, and have a better idea of where to go for your own ancestors as you're trying to search for records, especially digitally. So I'm open for any questions for the rest of the time.
Okay, thank you so much for that presentation, Jacqueline. We don't have any questions in the chat yet, but if anyone has any, please put them in there.
And then I can post I have a handout link. Do you want me to post that in the chat?
Yeah, that would be great. Do you already have a link to it? Oh,
Yes,
yeah, perfect.
right there. So if
Great.
any of you want a handout, oh, I think I need to change it to everyone. Let me try it again. That's a handout and has all the information from today, as well as I think in my handout I have like charts with the dates and links to different provincial archives and such. So hopefully that gives you a little head start. It's a lot to try to chomp down in an hour.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm kind of curious.
Please.
What are some places you've gone to see microfilm records?
Mm. I mean, my favorite place that I've gone to is the Archives of Ontario. I got to go there for a conference uh way long ago. Man, I feel old thinking about it. But the Archives of Ontario is actually located like on a campus as well. So I got to go into their actual archives, and they like take away all your pens and pencils, and you just get to go into this huge reading room. And when I was there, I got to go and look at all these land records where I got to go with my dad, and we found some land records for his great grandmother to talk about like where she came from in Ireland. And I thought it was such a great experience. And the archivists there were so knowledgeable. And like I was only maybe a couple years into my studies at the time when I went. But I think that's probably one of my favorite experiences that I got to do. And they held classes talking about United Empire Loyalists. They constantly had like a whole schedule of rotation of classes throughout the whole day. Mind you, this is before the pandemic that I went, but that was probably my favorite place to go.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on April 2nd with Bonnie L. Bossert on what is investigative genetic genealogy. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.